I want to start with a letter. You have probably never heard of it. But this letter decided whether the Trump family would ever exist. In 1905, a German immigrant named Friedrich Trump sat in the village of Karlstadt and wrote to Prince Luitpold of Bavaria. The letter was desperate. Friedrich begged to be allowed to stay in Germany with his wife and unborn child. He had left the country 20 years earlier without completing his mandatory military service. Bavaria considered him a deserter. The prince said no. Friedrich and his pregnant wife Elizabeth boarded a ship back to New York. 3 months later, their son was born. They named him Frederick, but everyone called him Fred. That boy would build 27,000 apartments across Brooklyn and Queens. His grandson would become President of the United States. None of it was certain. If the prince had granted that request, the Trump name might still belong to a winemaking family in a quiet German village. No Brooklyn Empire. No towers on Fifth Avenue. This is the story of what came next. 4 generations of a family that reshaped American real estate and American politics. A fortune that began in Klondike brothels and survived a pandemic. One that weathered Senate investigations and crushed at least one of its own who wanted nothing to do with it. It starts in 1885. A teenage boy at the port of Bremen, boarding a ship to America. Mining the miners. On July 17, 1897, the Seattle Post-Intelligencer ran a headline that would change Friedrich Trump's life. Gold, shiploads of it, arriving from the Yukon on steamers packed with successful prospectors. The entire city caught the fever. Friedrich was 28 years old. He had been waiting for exactly this kind of moment. Not because he wanted to find gold. Because he knew what gold seekers would need. He had been in America for 12 years by then. In 1885, he had crossed the Atlantic on the steamship Eider, a 16-year-old from a vineyard town called Karlstadt in the German Palatinate. His father had died when Friedrich was 8. The boy was too frail for vineyard work, so his mother apprenticed him to a barber in a neighboring village. When he finished his training, Karlstadt had no room for another barber. Friedrich left Germany behind. 6 years of cutting hair on the Lower East Side followed. He lived in crowded tenements, shared a room with his older sister, and saved what he could. Somewhere along the way, Friedrich started going by Frederick. The German name drew questions he preferred to avoid. New York was full of opportunity, but it was also full of barbers. Frederick wanted something bigger. In 1891, he moved to Seattle. The city had only been a state capital for 2 years, and it still carried the rawness of a frontier town. Saloons outnumbered churches. Timber money flowed loose. Frederick bought a small restaurant in the red light district called the Poodle Dog. The name soon changed to the Dairy Restaurant, but the offerings stayed the same: food, drink, and private rooms upstairs. "Rooms for ladies" was the phrase in newspaper ads. Everyone in Seattle understood what that meant. Frederick was figuring something out. The real money is never where everyone else is looking. It is in what those people need when they get there. When the Klondike gold rush exploded, roughly 100,000 people headed north toward the Yukon. The journey alone could kill you. Prospectors hauled a year's worth of supplies over the Chilkoot Pass, a frozen climb so steep that men moved in a single file line stretching miles up the mountainside. Those who survived the pass still had to build boats and navigate 600 miles of lakes and rivers to reach the goldfields. A third of the 100,000 made it to the Klondike. Fewer than 4% ever found gold. Frederick did not bother trying. He followed the crowds north, but he brought a frying pan instead of a pickaxe. In Bennett, British Columbia, a chaotic transit camp had sprung up where the Chilkoot Trail met the shore of Lake Bennett. At its peak, close to 10,000 people crowded the waterfront. Tents and rough timber buildings lined the shore. Frederick and a partner named Ernest Levin built the Arctic restaurant and hotel right in the middle of it all. The establishment advertised itself as the finest north of Vancouver. Biographer Gwenda Blair described the real draw as food, drink, and female companionship. Thousands of prospectors camped through the winter, waiting for the spring thaw so they could float their boats toward Dawson City. They had money and time, but nowhere to spend either. Frederick gave them exactly that place. The arrangement lasted until the geography changed. When the White Pass and Yukon Route Railroad opened a new path to the goldfields, travelers could bypass Bennett entirely. The town emptied almost overnight. Frederick did not sit and watch his investment rot. He dismantled the restaurant, hauled the precious lumber north to Whitehorse, and rebuilt the operation where the rail line met the river. Same formula, new town. The money led, and Frederick followed until the money dried up. By 1900, the rush was fading. Large mining companies were replacing the lone prospectors who had made the Yukon famous. Frederick had spent about 2 years in the north and never once swung a pickaxe. He sold what he could, collected his earnings, and headed back to New York. 31 years old and wealthier than most men twice his age. His grandsons would later argue about who built the family fortune. But the seed capital came from a wooden restaurant on a frozen lakeshore, where a German immigrant figured out a lesson his descendants would repeat for the next century. You do not dig for gold, you sell the shovels. Banished. A year after leaving the Yukon, Frederick Trump went home. Not to New York, to Karlstadt. No one in the village expected to see him again. The frail boy who had slipped away to America at 16 returned well-dressed, confident, and carrying the earnings of a frontier career that stretched from Seattle to the Yukon. Frederick was not visiting. He was settling down. Within weeks, he proposed to Elizabeth Christ, the daughter of a former neighbor. She was 21, 11 years younger, and from a family his own mother considered beneath them. None of that slowed him down. They married on August 26, 1902, and sailed for New York. Elizabeth was miserable almost from the moment she arrived. Manhattan overwhelmed her. The noise, the density, the foreignness of everything. According to historian Franz Meyer at the Rhineland-Palatinate State Archives, she lasted roughly 2 years before making it clear she wanted to go home. Frederick agreed. By 1904, they were back in Karlstadt with their infant daughter, Elizabeth. Frederick planned to stay permanently. That plan collapsed the moment he reappeared in Bavarian civil records. Local officials discovered what the young emigrant had hoped the world would forget. He had left Germany in 1885 without completing his mandatory military service. His departure had never been registered. On February 27, 1905, a royal decree stripped Frederick Trump of his citizenship and ordered him to leave the kingdom. He wrote directly to Prince Luitpold, addressing him as well-loved, noble, wise, and just. The letter described his parents as honest and pious people and pleaded that expulsion would destroy his young family. At the bottom of the page, he signed with the name he had been born with, Friedrich Trump. The appeal was rejected without explanation. In July 1905, Frederick and Elizabeth left Karlstadt for the last time. She was 7 months pregnant. On October 11th in the Bronx, their second child arrived. They named him Frederick Christ Trump, though everyone would call him Fred. A third child, John, followed in 1907. The family settled in Queens. Frederick bought vacant lots in Woodhaven and Jamaica estates, small parcels he planned to develop over time. He managed a restaurant and hotel while building his property holdings on the side. After 2 decades of chasing frontier money across 3 countries, Frederick was finally putting down roots. Then the Spanish flu arrived. On May 29, 1918, Frederick took a walk through Queens with his 12-year-old son. Somewhere along the route, he collapsed. Doctors were called. What first looked like pneumonia turned out to be one of the earliest cases of the Spanish flu in New York, a pandemic that would kill an estimated 50 million people worldwide. By the next morning, Frederick Trump was dead at 49. The estate was smaller than the life that produced it. He left behind a 7-room house in Queens, 5 vacant lots, a modest savings, and 14 mortgages on properties he had been accumulating over the past decade. Roughly $31,000 total, something like $670,000 in today's money. not yet an empire, but not nothing. Elizabeth, 37 and alone with 3 children, faced a choice that most widows of the era never really had. She could sell the properties, take what they were worth, and go back to the village in Germany where she had grown up. A comfortable and entirely reasonable decision. She refused. Elizabeth held on to the lots, the mortgages, and the small portfolio her husband had assembled. Fred was too young to sign contracts or carry a license, so she formed a company and gave it a name that mapped out the family's future, E. Trump and Son. Her son moved fast. At 17, Fred built his first house in Woodhaven, Queens, paid for with $800 from the family savings. He sold it at a profit and broke ground on the next one before the season ended. The boy who had been walking beside his father the day the flu struck was now carrying the family forward, one house at a time. Brooklyn's master builder Fred Trump wore a suit to construction sites. He showed up every morning, walked the lots, checked the materials, and made sure nobody wasted a dime. The limousine he drove through Brooklyn carried custom plates that read FCT, his initials, recognized by every contractor and politician in the borough. By the time he was done, Fred Trump would own or manage more than 27,000 apartments across New York City. Getting there took 4 decades, a world war, and a political machine that ran on favors. Through the 1920s and 30s, Fred expanded from single-family homes to entire blocks of row houses across Flatbush and East Brooklyn. He used FHA loans almost from the moment the program launched in 1934, borrowing federal money at terms so generous that his personal risk on each project shrank nearly to zero. The Brooklyn Daily Eagle called him the Henry Ford of the home building industry in 1938. The comparison fit. Fred treated housing like an assembly line, standardizing materials and floor plans so he could build faster and cheaper than any competitor in the city. At the same time, Fred was carefully constructing something besides apartment buildings, an identity. After the war, he told business partners and customers that his family was Swedish, not German. The deception served a practical purpose. Fred's most reliable market was middle-class Jewish families in Brooklyn and Queens, and German heritage was toxic in the years after World War II. His cousin John Walter, the family's unofficial historian, later explained the logic to the New York Times. He said, "You don't sell apartments after the war if you're German, so he's Swedish, no problem." The story held for decades, and eventually made it into Donald Trump's 1987 book, The Art of the Deal, where he wrote that his grandfather came here from Sweden as a child. In 1936, Fred married Mary Ann MacLeod, an immigrant from the Isle of Lewis in Scotland's Outer Hebrides. She had arrived in America 6 years earlier at 18, speaking Gaelic as her first language, listing domestic as her occupation on the ship's manifest. Together, they would have 5 children between 1937 and 1948. Mary Ann came first, then Fred Jr., then Elizabeth, Donald, and Robert. The family needed more room. Fred built them a 23-room Georgian Revival mansion at 8514 Midland Parkway in Jamaica Estates, 9 bathrooms, a detached garage for the limousine. During the war, Fred built barracks and garden apartments for the United States Navy along the East Coast. Nearly 1,400 wartime units in Norfolk, Virginia. More in Chester, Pennsylvania, and Newport News. He kept a low profile through those years, careful that his German background might surface among tenants and officials. When the fighting ended and millions of veterans came home needing housing, Fred was positioned better than anyone in the city to deliver it. The post-war years brought real scale. Shorehaven and Bensonhurst was the breakthrough, 32 6-story buildings and a shopping center backed by close to $10 million in federal financing. Beach Haven near Coney Island followed with 1,860 apartments and another $16 million from the same program. Fred had figured out how to build entire neighborhoods while shouldering almost none of the financial risk. The federal government guaranteed the loans. Fred's margins were enormous. None of it happened in a vacuum. Fred embedded himself in the Brooklyn Democratic machine and stayed there for the rest of his career. Erwin Steingut, the local party boss, ran an insurance company in the same building as Fred's office at 66 Court Street. Abraham Beam, a young accountant who would one day become mayor of New York, was a regular dinner companion. The most important connection was Abraham Bunny Lindenbaum, a fixer and attorney who understood zoning law and political leverage better than anyone in the borough. Fred picked all three of them up in his limousine and took them to dinner. They made sure his zoning requests and project approvals sailed through the system. The crown jewel was Trump Village on Coney Island. 3,800 apartments in 7 towers, designed by Morris Lapidus, the architect behind the Fontainebleau Hotel in Miami Beach. The project received a $60 million state construction loan. To get the land, Fred used his political connections to override a competing bid from the Garment Workers Union Housing Fund. 900 families already living on the site were displaced. Fred offered them units in the new development, knowing most could not afford the prices. Trump Village was one of the few projects Fred ever attached his name to. It marked the peak. By the early 1960s, Fred Trump had built more housing than any private developer in New York City, most of it funded by government money, enabled by political friends, and constructed as cheaply as the contracts would allow. But the money that built the empire was about to become its biggest problem. Before the Senate. In the summer of 1954, Fred Trump sat in a witness chair in Washington and was asked to account for $3.7 million that could not be found in the buildings he had been paid to construct. The United States Senate Banking Committee had launched an investigation into developers who profiteered from federal housing contracts. The FHA program was built to deliver affordable homes for returning veterans and working families. Investigators had discovered that builders were inflating construction budgets to pocket the gap between what they claimed a project cost and what it actually cost to build. Fred was one of several hauled in to testify. His numbers stood out. The case centered on Beach Haven, the Coney Island apartment complex that Fred had built with millions in government-backed loans. An FHA investigator named William McKenna had gone through the project's books and found a gap of at least $3.5 million between reported costs and actual expenditures. That surplus never returned to the federal program. It ended up with Fred Trump. McKenna laid out the mechanics for the senators. Fred and his business partner had purchased a parcel of land for $34,200. They then leased the same land back to their own corporation for nearly $77,000 per year under a 99-year contract. If the apartments ever defaulted on the mortgage, the FHA would owe them close to $2 million in remaining lease payments. On top of that, Fred had inflated the overall construction budget to secure a larger loan than the project required. Every dollar of the gap became profit. Senator Homer Capehart of Indiana called what he was hearing nauseous. He compared the profiteering to the Teapot Dome scandal, the 1920s bribery case that sent a sitting cabinet secretary to prison and became a byword for government corruption in America. President Eisenhower, briefed separately on the investigation's findings, reportedly called the developers involved sons of bitches. Fred's own testimony offered the committee almost nothing to work with. Asked when he had purchased a specific property, he told the senators it might have been 5 or 8 or 10 years earlier. Pressed on other financial details, he responded with long pauses and answers so vague that they appeared designed to run out the clock. Whether it was genuine confusion or calculated evasion, the effect was the same. The committee got no admissions and no specifics. One more detail emerged during the hearings. Fred's business partner on Beach Haven was a man named Willie Tomasello, who held a 25% stake in the project. Tomasello had documented connections to both the Gambino and Genovese crime families. Fred confirmed the partnership under questioning, but declined to discuss his partner's background. The hearings made front pages. Editorials demanded reform. The broader investigation found that the problem extended well beyond New York, with builders in multiple states accused of running similar schemes on FHA contracts. And then almost nothing happened. No charges were filed, no fines were levied, no contracts were revoked. The Brooklyn political machine that had spent years clearing Fred's path through city and state bureaucracy held firm. Bunny Lindenbaum stayed on as his attorney. Abe Beam kept showing up for dinner. The network Fred had spent decades building did exactly what networks do when they are tested. It protected its own. Within a few years, Fred broke ground on Trump Village. 3,800 apartments on Coney Island, backed by a $60 million state construction loan. The same government that had just called him before the Senate for profiteering on public money was now writing him the biggest check of his career. The physicist. In January 1943, Nikola Tesla died alone in a room at the New Yorker Hotel in Manhattan. The inventor had spent his final years making claims about a weapon he called Teleforce, a theoretical device the press shortened to Death Ray. Whether the thing existed anywhere outside Tesla's imagination remained unknown. The federal government wanted the question resolved before anyone else gained access to his papers. The Office of Alien Property called in a physics professor from MIT to review the documents. His name was John George Trump. He was Fred Trump's younger brother. The two had grown up in the same house on Devonshire Road in Jamaica Estates after their father Friedrich died of the Spanish flu in 1918. Fred left school early and built his first house as a teenager. John took a different path entirely. He enrolled at the Polytechnic Institute of Brooklyn, transferred to MIT, and completed a doctorate in electrical engineering in 1933. While Fred was mass-producing row houses in Flatbush, John was working in a laboratory alongside the physicist Robert Van de Graaff. Together they developed high-voltage electrostatic generators capable of producing over 1 million volts of energy. The technology had military and industrial uses, but the application that came to define John's career was medicine. He and Van de Graaff adapted the generators to deliver targeted radiation to tumors that had previously been considered inoperable. By the late 1930s, their equipment had been installed in a Boston area hospital. It was among the earliest practical uses of high-energy radiation therapy in the country, and the approach they pioneered became a foundation of modern radiation oncology. When World War II broke out, MIT became the home of the Radiation Laboratory, a massive Allied effort to develop radar. John joined the program and spent the war years working on systems that helped ships detect submarines and gave bomber crews the ability to locate targets through heavy cloud cover. He reportedly served in a liaison role with British researchers, and according to some accounts was present in the European theater near the end of the war. The specifics of his wartime service remain partly classified and partly uncertain, but his contribution was substantial enough that the government continued to call on his expertise for years afterward. That is how he ended up in a room full of Tesla's papers. John reviewed the documents and equipment and delivered his conclusion to the authorities. Nothing in the collection contained a workable weapons design. Nothing posed a military risk. Tesla's death ray appeared to be a theoretical concept without engineering substance to support it. The threat was not real. John returned to MIT and stayed for decades. He co-founded the High Voltage Engineering Corporation, which commercialized the generator technology and built particle accelerators and radiation therapy equipment for hospitals and research institutions worldwide. In 1983, President Reagan presented him with the National Medal of Science, the highest scientific honor in the United States. The citation recognized his contributions to radar, nuclear physics, and medical therapy. He died in February 1985 at 77. In his final years, he was still at MIT, still consulting with former students, still working at the intersection of physics and medicine that had occupied him since the 1930s. The two Trump brothers had been raised by the same widowed mother, buried the same father, and started with the same family resources. Fred used those resources to build apartment complexes and cultivate political allies. John used them to build particle accelerators and treat cancer patients. Both were effective at what they did. Both built things that lasted. They simply chose to build different things for different reasons. Donald Trump has mentioned his uncle frequently over the years. "My uncle was a great professor at MIT for, I think, 41 years, he told one interviewer. The The reference appeared designed to suggest that the Trump family's abilities ran deeper than real estate. But John's career pointed to something less flattering. The same family that produced a brilliant physicist also made certain he would be the least remembered Trump of his generation. John G. Trump spent his entire career outside the family business. His name never appeared on an apartment building or a government contract. He published his research, collected his awards, and left behind a body of work that outlived him quietly. He is the Trump almost nobody remembers. A chauffeur in the sky at Lehigh University in Pennsylvania, classmates remembered Fred Trump Jr. as a natural entertainer. Warm, social, quick to make people laugh. He joined Sigma Alpha Mu, a historically Jewish fraternity, even though his family was not Jewish. A classmate later told reporters that Freddie, as his friends called him, was as far from Donald's personality as you can get. He was the eldest son and the expected heir to the family business. Freddie tried. He worked in the organization, appeared in newspapers as a vice president of E. Trump and Son in 1966, and spent time on his father's construction sites. But the fit was wrong. He and his father had fundamentally different temperaments, and the work did not hold him. What did hold him was flying. In 1964, Freddie applied to the Trans World Airlines pilot training program. TWA was Howard Hughes's airline, and competition for pilot positions was steep. Freddie was accepted. He completed the training, qualified as a co-pilot, and began flying commercial routes. By the accounts of people who knew him, this was the version of Freddie that made sense. He was good at it. And it had nothing to do with his father's buildings. Fred Sr. reportedly dismissed the career with a phrase that would follow his son for the rest of his life. He called him a chauffeur in the sky. Donald, 10 years younger and already working in the family business, echoed the tone. "Come on, Freddie, what are you doing?" he said, according to accounts later relayed by Freddie's daughter, Mary. "You're wasting your time." Freddie had married Linda Clapp in 1962, a stewardess he met while she was vacationing in the Bahamas. TWA did not allow married stewardesses, so Linda resigned when they got engaged. They moved into one of Fred Sr.'s apartments in Jamaica, Queens, and had 2 children. Frederick III was born in November of that year. A daughter, Mary, followed in 1965. The drinking had started by the late 1960s. Whether the family pressure triggered it or accelerated something already forming, the result was the same. Freddie's work suffered. Fellow pilots noticed the change. TWA let him go. The career that had given him an identity outside the Trump name was over. The marriage did not survive either. Freddie and Linda divorced in the mid-1970s. With the airline gone and the marriage over, Freddie drifted back into his father's orbit. He took a position doing maintenance on Trump properties, handling repairs in the apartment buildings Fred Sr. owned across Brooklyn and Queens. According to multiple accounts, he moved back into his parents' house on Midland Parkway in Jamaica Estates. The mansion had 23 rooms and 9 bathrooms. Freddie did not move into one of them. He lived in the attic. It was unfurnished. The eldest son of the man who had built more housing than any private developer in New York was living in an empty room at the top of his father's house, repairing other people's apartments for a living. On September 26, 1981, Freddie died of a heart attack. He was 42. Chronic alcohol abuse had destroyed his body. Reports indicate he had undergone surgery to remove part of his stomach before the end. He left behind 2 children under the age of 20. Years later, Donald described his brother in an interview as a fantastic guy who got stuck on alcohol. In a separate conversation, he offered something rarer. "I do regret having put pressure on him." The code on the application. On rental applications at Trump-owned apartment buildings, employees had developed a system. When a black person applied for an apartment, staff members marked the paperwork with a single letter. See, it stood for colored. The marking was not isolated to one building or one rental agent. Federal investigators found the practice across multiple properties maintained over years, consistent enough to constitute a pattern rather than an accident. It was the physical trace of a policy that shaped who lived in Trump buildings and who did not. The investigation began in the early 1970s, when the United States Department of Justice started looking into housing discrimination across New York City. The probe focused on Trump Management Corporation, the company Fred Trump had built, and that his 27-year-old son Donald was helping to run. In October of 1973, the DOJ filed a civil rights lawsuit against Fred Trump, Donald Trump, and the corporation. The charge was systematic violation of the Fair Housing Act across 39 buildings containing more than 14,000 rental units. The government built its case through testing. Pairs of applicants were sent to Trump rental offices in Brooklyn and Queens. One was black. The other was white. Their income and qualifications were comparable. The results were consistent across buildings. White applicants were shown available apartments and invited to sign leases. Black applicants were told nothing was open or were directed toward complexes with higher minority populations. At a property called Ocean Terrace, records showed that barely 1% of tenants were black. At Lincoln Shore, the figure was 0. Fred and Donald Trump did not respond with contrition. They hired Roy Cohn. Cohn had spent 2 decades building a reputation for ruthless and theatrical legal warfare. He first became publicly known in the 1950s as chief counsel to Senator Joseph McCarthy during the anti-communist hearings that consumed Washington. When McCarthy's campaign collapsed under public scrutiny, Cohn pivoted to private practice in Manhattan. His client list came to include mob bosses, real estate developers, and political operators who needed problems to disappear. The method was always the same. Go on the attack before the other side can set the terms. Cohn's first move on behalf of the Trumps was to file a countersuit against the Department of Justice for $100 million. The filing accused the government of using unfair investigation tactics and making reckless accusations. It was dismissed. But it served a purpose beyond the courtroom. The countersuit sent a public signal that the Trumps considered themselves the wronged party and intended to treat the lawsuit as an assault rather than an accusation to be answered. The case was settled in June of 1975. Under the terms of the agreement, Trump management committed to a series of changes. The company would advertise vacancies in minority-focused media. It would notify the Urban League of available units, and it would allow the Justice Department to review its compliance over the following years. The settlement did not require Fred or Donald Trump to admit that any discrimination had taken place. It imposed no financial penalty on anyone. Roy Cohn remained Donald Trump's personal attorney and advisor for the next decade, shaping his legal instincts and public posture on matters well beyond housing policy. Cohn was disbarred in 1986 for unethical conduct. He died of complications from AIDS later that same year. 3 years after the settlement, in 1978, the Department of Justice filed a new complaint. Trump management, the government alleged, was still failing to meet the conditions it had agreed to. The company denied the charge. All County Building Supply. In 1992, Fred Trump's children created a company called All County Building Supply and Maintenance. The company purchased boilers, cleaning supplies, and maintenance equipment for Fred's apartment buildings across Brooklyn and Queens, then billed the buildings for each item at cost plus a service fee. It was a normal enough arrangement. The fee was not. According to a New York Times investigation published in 2018, every invoice that passed through All County carried a markup of 20 to 50% above the actual purchase price. The difference flowed directly to Fred Trump's 4 surviving children: Donald, Marianne, Robert, and Elizabeth. The payments were structured to look like operating costs for the apartment buildings, rather than what they actually were. To the IRS, the invoices registered as routine maintenance expenses. The generational wealth transfer hiding inside them went undetected for years. All County was only one channel. The Times spent over a year reviewing more than 100,000 pages of financial records, including confidential tax returns, bank statements, and financial disclosures that had never been made public. The investigation, which later won the Pulitzer Prize for explanatory reporting, documented a pattern of transfers that stretched back decades. Fred and Mary Trump had moved more than $1 billion in real estate assets to their children through property sales priced far below market value, interest-free loans that were never repaid, trust arrangements structured to shrink the taxable estate, and the all-county invoice scheme, which ran for roughly a decade. The reported property values made the scale visible. Fred's real estate holdings were listed on tax filings at a combined $41.4 million. Those same properties were later sold for more than 16 times that amount. The gap between reported worth and market price represented hundreds of millions in assets that were never fully taxed. On the total value of the transfers, the Trump family paid $52.2 million in taxes, roughly 5% of what changed hands. The Times calculated that at prevailing federal estate tax rates, the obligation would have been many times that figure. By the time the largest transfers were taking place, Fred Trump was losing the ability to manage his own affairs. He received an Alzheimer's diagnosis in the early 1990s, and his decline was steady. The builder who had once walked every job site and questioned every line item could no longer oversee the empire he had spent a lifetime assembling. Legal and financial authority shifted to his children, primarily Donald and Robert. The buildings Fred had controlled for half a century were now in the hands of the people who stood to inherit them. Fred Trump died on June 25, 1999. He was 93. He and Mary had never left the house on Midland Parkway, the same mansion where they raised 5 children and where their eldest son had spent his last years in an unfurnished attic. Mary died 13 months later, in August of 2000. The estate was divided according to a will that had been revised multiple times, including during the years of Fred's illness. Fred Jr.'s 2 children, Mary and Frederick III, received significantly less than their aunts and uncles. That discrepancy would soon produce a legal fight inside the family. When the New York Times published its findings in October of 2018, the statute of limitations had expired on most of the transactions described. Criminal prosecution was no longer possible for the bulk of what the investigation uncovered. The New York State Tax Department opened a civil inquiry in response to the reporting. The fortune that began with a restaurant in the Yukon and grew into tens of thousands of apartments across New York had been transferred to the next generation. The cost to the family, in taxes, was roughly 5 cents on every dollar. The inheritance. When Fred Trump Sr. died in 1999, his will divided the estate among his surviving children. Donald, Marianne, Robert, and Elizabeth each received substantial interests in the family's real estate holdings. Fred Jr.'s 2 children did not. Mary Trump and her brother Frederick III, the grandchildren whose father had died in an attic of the family mansion 18 years earlier, were left with a share that bore little resemblance to what their aunts and uncles received. They challenged the will, and the response came quickly. Frederick III had a young son named William, born with cerebral palsy. The child required ongoing medical care. The costs were covered through a health insurance plan carried by the Trump family business. According to Mary Trump's later account and legal filings in the case, that coverage was terminated after she and her brother formally contested the terms of the will. A family worth over $1 billion, according to the financial records that would later become public, had cut medical insurance for an infant with a serious neurological condition while his father was in the middle of a legal dispute over inheritance. Mary and Frederick III settled. In 2001, they accepted approximately $2.7 million and signed away their claims. At the time, neither had access to the full scope of the family's financial records. They did not know about all county building supply. They did not know that the properties they had been told were worth tens of millions had been assessed at a fraction of their actual market value. They accepted what was offered and moved on. For the next 17 years, the terms of the settlement stood unchallenged. Then the New York Times published its investigation. The same reporting that exposed the invoice scheme and the billion-dollar transfer also made clear what the estate had actually been worth when Mary and her brother signed away their claims. The $2.7 million settlement which had seemed like a negotiated outcome between family members, now looked like the result of a process in which one side held all the information and the other held none. Mary Trump responded publicly. In 2020, she published a memoir titled Too Much and Never Enough, describing the family dynamics that shaped her father's life and her own experience of being shut out. The book described a household built on dominance and conditional approval, where Fred Sr. rewarded aggression and punished softness. Her father, the pilot who joined a Jewish fraternity and made people laugh, had been the first to pay the price. Mary argued she and her brother were next. That same year, she filed a lawsuit in New York State Court against Donald Trump, Marianne Trump Barry, and the estate of Robert Trump, who had died in August of 2020. The suit alleged that the three had defrauded Mary and her brother by misrepresenting the value of the estate, manipulating the ailing Fred Sr., and pressuring the pair into a settlement based on numbers that were deliberately false. The court ruled against her. The judge found that the 2001 agreement was legally binding. Mary and Frederick III had signed a release, and the release held. The fact that they had not known the true value of the assets at the time did not void the contract they had agreed to. After Fred and Mary Sr. both died, the house on Midland Parkway where the family had lived for half a century was sold. So was the Tudor on Wareham Place where Donald Trump was born, built by his father in 1940, later auctioned to a private buyer for $2.14 million. The physical landmarks of the Trump family's life in Queens passed into other hands, one by one. The legal fight was over. Mary and Frederick III kept their $2.7 million. Their aunts and uncles kept the rest. The vineyard and the empire Karlstadt is still there. The vineyards line the same Palatinate hillsides that Friedrich Trump's family worked before he was born. The village has roughly 1,200 residents today. A few still share the Trump name. The house where Friedrich grew up stands on a quiet street, unremarkable and unsigned. In the Landesarchiv in Speyer, about 30 kilometers to the south, a letter sits in a filing cabinet. Written in 1905 by a man about to be expelled from his country, it is addressed to Prince Luitpold of Bavaria and asks permission to stay. The handwriting is careful. The tone shifts between deference and desperation. The request was denied. Friedrich Trump is buried at All Faith Cemetery in the Middle Village neighborhood of Queens, New York. Elizabeth, who never wanted to leave Germany, lies near him. Fred is there as well. The builder who turned government contracts and political favors into tens of thousands of apartments across New York City, and who spent 3 decades telling everyone his family came from Sweden. Fred Jr. is nearby. The pilot. 42 when his heart stopped. The buildings Fred Sr. constructed still stand across Brooklyn and Queens. Shore Haven in Bensonhurst, Beach Haven near Coney Island, Trump Village on the boardwalk. Tens of thousands of people live in apartments Fred Trump built. His name appears on almost none of them. That was his preference. His brother John left no buildings at all. He left research, particle accelerators, and a National Medal of Science. John chose a life outside the family business, and is not buried with the others in Queens. The wealth Fred Sr. assembled was passed to his 4 surviving children through a system that, according to a New York Times investigation, included fraudulent valuations and padded invoices routed through a company called All County Building Supply. The tax obligation on those transfers should have reached into the hundreds of millions of dollars. The family paid a fraction. Fred Jr.'s children, the grandchildren of the man who built everything, received $2.7 million after signing a settlement they entered without access to the estate's true financial records. The house on Midland Parkway where the Trumps lived for half a century was sold after Fred and Mary died. So was the Tudor on Wareham Place where Donald was born, built by his father in 1940, later auctioned to a private buyer for just over $2 million. The physical landmarks of the family's life in Queens have passed out of Trump hands, one property at a time. The letter in Speyer has not moved. A single page, addressed to a prince, asking permission to remain in Germany. The permission was not granted. The family that grew from that refusal is still here.